Okay, ready. Hey, thank you for coming. It's so beautiful outside. I can't believe the room filled up. But thanks for coming. I'm Tracy Nally. I am a local attorney. I work for News Gazette Media. So I work for, an established conventional media group in town. And I think the reason why I was invited to this is because, as such, I am a real believer in free speech, people being able to say what they want to say in a considered, peaceful, thoughtful way, whether they agree with me or not, especially if they don't agree with me. So, that's why I think I'm here, and I'm here to be the moderator today. Now, it's very likely that I won't have to do anything but introduce the panel, and that would be a really good afternoon. So, also one other thing is that I have a 37-year career as an attorney, and part of that is in employment discrimination. I've had a lot of experience in employment discrimination, and I've seen over these 37 years a lot of different kinds of discrimination develop. Like there wasn't disability discrimination when I graduated from law school. There was no age discrimination, or it was just new, brand new. Sexual harassment was not considered a form of discrimination when I graduated from law school. So I think we're now on the beginning of another type of discrimination with respect to transgender. And I don't know how that's all going to develop in the law, but I'm very curious, and I'm going to be a very good listener today so that I can have a considered opinion about it, and I hope you all join me in listening closely and participating in this conversation. Today's speakers have traveled a long way to be heard, and our time is limited. Anyone disrupting or interfering with their ability to be heard will be asked to leave. Now, this is the way it's going to go. Each panelist is going to talk for 8 or 10 minutes serially, and then after they're done, we will open it up for questions and discussion. I'll tell you the names of the three panelists now, and before each of them starts to talk, I'll read a short description of who they are, and then they'll tell you about themselves. But the three panelists are Corinna Cohn, Carrie Callahan, and Nina Bailey. So everyone, the first person who's going to talk is Corinna Cohn. Corinna Cohn is an adult transsexual from Indianapolis. Having undertaken hormone therapies and sex reassignment surgery as a teenager, Corinna addresses the responsibilities accrued by a male inhabiting the social role of women and what young people should know before making an irreversible commitment to transition. Thank you, Corinna.
Thank you. Thank you for everybody for coming out today. Let's talk about football. There is this thing called CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Have you heard of it?
Yeah.
Football is a sport that everyone in America, or many people in America, love. But there are some people who say football players in the NFL and in college are getting injured and having these permanent brain injuries as part of their sport. They're saying players should be safer, the NFL should be doing more to deal with the medical issues, and the NFL and some talking heads in return say, you hate football. If you criticize the NFL, you hate football, you're trying to ruin the sport, you want to bring it down for everybody. We've got to bind together and protect the NFL from their players with the brain injuries. So I bring this up because I'm going to say some critical things about the trans community today. And it's not because I hate the trans community. It is because I see that in the trans community there are some things that are analogous to people getting brain injuries. Wasn't planning to say it that way, but maybe there's some truth to that. The topic today is whether material reality matters when it comes to sex and gender identity. Well, a couple of years ago, it was my first opportunity to have an exam with my physician, a full physical. And the question of whether material reality matters doesn't occur to you when you're having a prostate exam. So today we're here to talk about the conflict between gender identity and whether biological sex matters anymore when gender identity is on the rise. My answer is that yes, biological sex does matter. I'm a transsexual, and it's only possible for me to be a transsexual because I was born one sex, and I undertook a series of treatments in order to change my sex to appear more like the opposite sex. If biological sex doesn't exist, then you can't transition. There's nothing from which to transition from. So before I get too much further, I want to define a couple of my terms, because I'm going to be talking a little bit about transgender ideology, and I think it's only fair for everyone who wants to participate in my conversation, or this conversation, that I define my term first. So transgender ideology is the belief that biological sex is subordinate to one's personal identification as a woman or a man. Transgender ideology asserts that it's impossible to define female in a way that doesn't exclude trans women or male in a way that doesn't include trans men. That's going to be the whole of my definition of transgender ideology. I think that there's some other surface area to talk about with it, but to me this is the core of it, that if you believe something or wish something hard enough, it changes reality. What I know from my own experiences is that as much as you can alter your appearance or your body, there's still something underlying that's permanent and true. When you face it and you accept it, it makes your life a little easier to deal with. Another term that I'd like to define is transsexual. Just upstairs a few minutes ago, I was checking out the Trans Inclusionary Network event, and I was introducing myself to somebody up there and revealed that I was going to be speaking here, which caused a little bit of consternation, and I said, "Don't worry, I'm a transsexual." And they said, "Well, nobody uses that term anymore," which I know, and I'm going to address that. But it's so relevant because I'm told, don't use that word. We don't want to hear it anymore. So a transsexual is someone who has been diagnosed with and is receiving or has received medical treatment for the conditions we call now gender dysphoria, or at the time that I transitioned, gender identity disorder. So you cannot identify as a transsexual without taking steps to transition, any more than you can identify as a football player without going out and playing football. The action of doing is what defines you as the doer. Identity is meaningless. So when I transitioned, the term transsexual was the common phrase. And it was even a couple of years, maybe about 1995, before I even heard the word transgender. It just wasn't in common use. What I learned upstairs a few minutes ago is that there's an entire generation of people who have never heard anything, any other word to describe people like me, that transgender is the normal word, the accepted word. And it may surprise you to hear this, but transgender is fairly recent. About 2003, there was a book published by an academic named J. Michael Bailey, who is up at Northwestern, I believe. And he published a book that was titled The Man Who Would Be Queen. The book was about his interactions. He went out to meet and interview and document transsexuals, and he agreed with Ray Blanchard's categorization that there's basically two types of transsexuals. Homosexual transsexuals who are only interested in having relationships with men, and autogynephilic transsexuals who have a sexual attraction to themselves as women. Regardless of whether I agree with those categorizations or not, J. Michael Bailey received a lot of heat from trans activists for publishing this book. There were activists who complained to Bailey's employer to try to get him fired. There was an activist named Andrea James who found pictures of Bailey's children on the internet and then put sexual innuendo phrased over them and sent them to him to harass him. And they tried to ruin Dr. Bailey professionally and personally. The people doing this were considered to be pillars of the trans community. Aside from Andrea James, I'm not going to mention the others. But I did a text search of the book. Remember that this was published in 2003 for the word transsexual and the word transgender. The word transsexual is used over 200 times in the book. The word transgender is only used 26 times. And it doesn't show up until halfway through the book when Bailey is choosing to use it to describe it as homosexual or transgender homosexuality to differentiate it from what we would normally think of as homosexuality. So even back in 2003, it wasn't really considered a mainstream term, even for an academic who was writing on the topic. So the next major milestone was a book by Julia Serrano called Whipping Girl. And in my opinion, this is one of the most important writings in transgender community because this established a lot of the ideas that are now extremely prevalent in the community. Serrano popularized the terms transgender and cisgender. And this was published in 2007. So this is when the conversation really started to change and the language about how we talk about trans issues started to change. 2007 was about the early period of the internet. There was no Reddit, there was not really social media quite up and running yet. And before that time, if you felt like you were perhaps trans and were seeking some information on the internet, you would go to sources like, I'm going to forget the name of it. There are a couple of trans bulletin boards, Susan's Place. So if you're looking for information, that's about the only place that you could find it. These were kind of out-of-the-way byways where if you're going to join and participate, you would create some sort of alter identity and try to learn about the community that way. Contrast that with today's world, where we do have Reddit. There's, I would have to guess, about 100. Let me explain Reddit in case you don't know. Reddit is a forum on the internet that has thousands and thousands of different categories for topics. And Reddit makes an effort not to be too censorious. So pretty much any topic that you would care to discuss, there's a forum on Reddit to talk about it. There are probably about 100 different trans-related subreddits, and that's the topic board. Many of them are created to create these circles of validation. So if you can imagine being a person who you don't feel like you have a place in the world necessarily, you're not comfortable in your own skin, you feel like you look a little strange in the mirror, like your body doesn't quite look like what you mentally think it ought to be, you want to reach out and you want to see if there's other people like you. Well, there's a lot of these spaces on the internet now between places like Reddit and Tumblr, where when you come to these communities and you say, I don't know if I'm trans or not, almost unanimously, every voice that you hear is going to say, yes, you are trans. Yes, if you're coming to us presenting as a boy, yes, you can actually be a girl inside, you just seize it. And there's not a lot of critical inquiry, like, would this work well for you? What do you want to get out of it? Are you aware of some of the dangers in taking these medicines? Do you know that some people who are trying to do it are trying to solve one problem when they have a different problem? There's very little consideration of who's coming into the community. It's like this big whirlpool that pulls people in. This coincides with the rise of what is now called intersectional feminism, where we define people in terms of all of the different sort of categories they belong to. So for example, I would say that I'm a white, transsexual, half Jewish, neurotypical, you're laughing, but this is very much, this is able-bodied, right, vision.
Yeah.
What's that?
Thin.
Thin? Well, see, you should have seen me a couple years ago. Yeah, thin. I have thin privilege, which, okay. But the premise of intersectional feminism is that the world needs to be a more fair and just place, and the way that we do this is by being very aware of what privileges we have over other people. But unfortunately, even though this is like a good premise and something that people should be considerate of, it has been weaponized and used to drive people away from each other by defining tinier and tinier and tinier categories, and then also implicitly asking people in these categories to sort themselves into a hierarchy. And wow, intersectional feminism creating hierarchies, maybe that's not a good idea. So in these communities, people who were born male and were raised male, or went to college, had successful careers, families, children, all as male, they begin identifying as transgender. And that suddenly moves them from whatever position of privilege that they had occupied into being extremely oppressed, allegedly. Whereas on the other hand, girls that get pulled into this, and I'm sure that there are some more like adult women who start to get into this a little bit, but this seems to be especially pernicious with girls and young women who adopt names like Aiden or Lucas. They start wearing breast binders, and on Tumblr or on Reddit, they get lectured and browbeaten to prioritize the emotional needs of transgender males. And there are some stories in some of these communities where the males in these positions use this in order to sexually predate women. So this is not great. Women and girls are being separated out and being told not to trust themselves, not to report these sorts of things, that if trans women are predating on them, that not to go to the justice system because they won't be treated fairly. And honestly, I don't know how to fix it, but I think the first thing to do is to recognize that it's happening. So this is taking me towards the end of what's been developing on the internet, and that is the term TERF. Does anybody not know the term? Okay, good. It's an acronym, and it stands for Transgender Exclusionary Radical Feminist, TERF. It was originally coined by an Australian feminist blogger who goes by the handle TikTok. But even if she coined it, she is not the person who popularized it. You've probably all heard of the term feminazi. And can you tell me what name you think of about feminazi? Rush Limbaugh. Rush Limbaugh was not the person who coined the phrase feminazi. It was actually a professor named Thomas Hazlitt. But nobody probably knows who Thomas Hazlitt is. But Rush Limbaugh gets all the credit. Well, yeah, credit.
Notoriety.
The notoriety. Thank you. Like the term feminazi, the term TERF was popularized by a trans blogger who is the editor of a website that's called Trans Advocate. And the editor is Kristen Williams, and Kristen Williams created a website called The TERFs and spent a lot of work on social media to get the trans community to start labeling women who were speaking about this issue, who were speaking about gender critically, as a TERF. That was about 2013. Over the last couple of years, the term TERF has appeared in all sorts of threats of violence. There was somebody who openly attended a trans parade with a bloodied shirt that said "Punch a TERF." There was just last week, I believe, I guess the term TERF wasn't brought up. I think somewhere there was somebody who had a T-shirt that said something like "I kill TERFs." At feminist or LGBT events, advertising these messages of violence. These messages are excused. The people defending them say trans people are oppressed, and therefore you should not be censoring anybody who is expressing these messages of violence because they are expressing these terms towards their oppressors, who are women, who are frequently lesbian women. Looking at it from a higher view, what we're seeing is LGBT events where male people are openly expressing violence towards women using misogynistic phrases, and that these people's needs are being prioritized over everyone else attending. This is an aspect of the transgender community that has to change. So, women were the original target of this slur TERF. But as more and more voices started speaking up saying, maybe there's a middle ground, maybe there's something that we have to do so that both women's needs and trans needs are met. Like, how do we compromise? And those people also started being called TERFs. And then eventually, I think maybe sometime late afternoon, the first man was chiming in on this. Sorry, cisgender man. Somebody said, hey, I think maybe it's not fair for somebody who achieved adulthood as a male to be competing in sports against women. And now that man is a TERF. And now anybody who says, hey, biological reality matters and is relevant and material reality is important is a TERF. So if you happen to agree with me that biology matters, that you cannot be a transsexual or transgender without moving to a different state of being, starting from male or going to female or vice versa. If you agree with me that you cannot wish your way into being a different sex, then you are also a TERF. Every time this word gets used, it gets robbed and leached a little bit of its meaning. It used to be terrifying to be called a TERF. It is becoming more and more normal or less shocking to be called a TERF, even though it still does have material effects on people. But the more people who misuse, or actually I don't think there's a good use for it, but the more people say it, the less punch it's going to have. And if anyone ever accuses you of being a TERF, I think you should say, so what if I am? In fact, I know a transsexual who's a TERF, and they're thin. Because of all of these word changes, one of the words that's been buried is the word transsexual. When I transitioned, there were basically two groups of us. There were transvestites or cross-dressers, and transsexuals, and the transsexuals were the ones that went all the way. Leave it to your imagination. And there was really no middle ground. So there were some people who thought that there ought to be a middle ground. And the term transgender was starting to be used to represent that middle ground. And that middle ground is largely occupied by gender nonconforming people who don't want their appearance to be clearly male or female. I think today we call them non-binary. It's occupied by cross-dressers who wanted the opportunity to live their lives day by day. I'm going way over on my time, aren't I?
No, keep going, but you're interesting.
And really, most importantly, that transgender middle is held by adult males who transition and they want to have hormone treatment because they feel that it's good for them to do it, and I'm not going to judge that. But critically, they don't want to have surgery on their bottoms. They want to keep their malehood intact. And it's really important that if you are in this category, that you try to knock drag queens out of it. Drag queens used to be transgender. I don't know if you know. They're not allowed to be anymore. But if you are in this position, you have to knock the other people out of the boat, because if somebody says, well, what's the difference between a transgender and a transsexual? And you say, well, a transsexual has gone all the way and had surgery. And then a reasonable person might say, well, that seems like an okay place to draw a line in terms of public accommodation. And we can't have that line drawn if we're going to include everybody. So I actually don't know the right place to draw the line. What I do know is that the word transgender has eclipsed everything about my identity, that when I go up to a room full of the trans-inclusive network, and I get told don't use the word transsexual. That's not my group, those aren't my people. We've been pushed out.